morning golfers, welcome to this week's newsletter piece on improving your golf. And this week, as we move into the wetter turf conditions, we're exploring the little chip pitch shots that we get very close to the green's edge, which can become quite saturated even on a nice downward golf course like the Dyke. And there's a couple of things that we tend to see happening that's causing a lot of duff chips. And once we hit those duff chips, we tend to see a few thin chips because we're so wary of duffing it again that we end up pulling the club away from the strike and thinning it through the green. What we tend to see primarily is people still following their standard setup, which they might play in bone hard summer conditions, which is a traditional sort of chip pitching stance with the ball position very much back towards their right heel, hands leaning heavily against, and playing that nice low checker into the green that bounces a few times, hopefully gets a bit of backspin with a nice soft quality golf ball, and then stops up for us. As we move into the wind, and when we play that shot, because the ground's so firm, if we do catch a millimetre behind the golf ball, it really doesn't matter too much. The club will just bounce a tiny bit and move into the strike and give us just as much ball speed to give us the correct distance each time. So we'll become very unaware that even if we do catch a millimetre behind the ball, that we won't even notice it. Whereas winter time, as I'm sure you're starting to become aware, if we're a millimetre or two behind the ball, we catch that turf, it's so wet it literally stops the club dead, and the ball travels about a yard or two, maybe rather than 10, 20 or 30. So there's a couple of things we can start to do to try and stop that from happening. One of the main ones is the ball position and how we position our balance, our weight between the 2 feet. Now normally with that back foot position, the club is working very much up and down in a quite steep angle of attack, and therefore it helps us get nicely down into the back of the ball with a lot of backspin, but midwinter, if we are a millimetre out with that steep angle of attack, the club's going to keep digging into the ground and it's not going to propel the ball forward at all. We're just going to get that classic duff. So what we can start to do is we can move that ball further forward in the stance, and rather than having so much shaft lean towards the target, we're going to have the shaft just about angled towards your target, as you can see here. And the idea of this being is that when we come through impact now, a bit like I say a 5-iron or a 7-iron, as the club comes through impact, the club is travelling very much shallower, almost running parallel with the base of the golf ball as it strikes it. And you can probably hear that difference in strike even there. It was a lot less downwards into the mat inside the room here, as opposed to earlier you could hear the downward strike a lot clearer, a lot steeper because the ball was further back in my stance. The other thing, as I move that ball position forward, I evened out the weight distribution between my 2 feet, my shoulders. My position of weight now is very much 50-50, as maybe again like a 7-iron. Because again, if we get forward on our left side, like we're taught to play that basic bump and run shot, again it brings the club down steeply, and that's what we want to try and get rid of in these winter shots. So 50-50 weight distribution, ball in the middle to slightly forward of your stance, forward of centre, and that will stop the club coming down steeply. Because it's coming in shallower, it gives us an easier, more consistent angle of attack. If we do catch a bit of ground before the ball strike, because the club is going forward rather than downwards, it won't catch the turf so heavily. The other things we can look at as well is what we call bounce. A lot of people tend not to look at it. We tend to walk into a shop and go, oh yeah, I want a 60, a 56 and a 50 loft on my wedge. but we generally don't look at the grind of the wedge or the amount of bounce. And again, just to explain bounce, it's really when the club's sitting on the floor, it's the angle from the front edge to the back edge. If you draw a line out from that back edge, the angle between my fingertip and the front edge there is really the bounce angle. And also the grind, you can see here the flange here at the bottom of the club is quite deep, quite wide. And this is a 12 bounce, which is quite high. And this is what we try and get you to do and use in the winter conditions, the wet conditions, because of that back edge here. If the front edge has got a bit steep in your angle of attack, even though we're trying to work on the technique, because this back edge is sitting beneath that front edge, it'll only let it dig a tiny bit into the turf before it bounces it forward and straight on towards the target. Again, helping you get a better result. Doesn't completely get rid of a duff, but it certainly becomes a lot harder to duff it with that sole than your traditional square base sole, where if this front edge digs into the turf, it's going to keep digging because there's nothing really there to help bounce it back up. Okay, so moving the ball forward, less weight distribution into the left side, giving it very much more 50-50. And therefore we're starting to what the people term as using the bounce. Because the club's coming in shallower because the ball is forward and our weight isn't as far forward, the club then glides and you can hear and feel the base of the club hitting the turf rather than the front edge digging into the turf. Give it a try next time you're out or around the chipping green. If you want to borrow a club with some bounce on it or more bounce on it, come and pop into the shop. We've got lots of demonstration wedges, Callaway, Vokey, Cleveland. Yeah, just pop your head in, take them out on the green edge and try it. If you still find you're chunking a little bit, there might be something else in the technique. If so, again, push the button that you'll see on the newsletter and give us a shout and we'll book you a lesson in. Many thanks.